This audiobook is the most powerful teaching ever recorded on how to bend reality itself and change your life from the inside out. As you listen, you will awaken to the truth. The world you believed was fixed has always been far more responsive to you than you were ever taught to believe. Tonight, you remember how to bend it. Introduction. You have spent your whole life believing in a world that does not move. You have been taught, quietly and thoroughly, from the earliest years of your childhood, that circumstances simply happen to you, that the shape of your days is decided elsewhere by forces beyond your reach, and that your only task is to endure whatever arrives at your door. This belief has settled so deeply into you over so many years, repeated so often by so many well-meaning voices, that you no longer even notice it as a belief at all. You have mistaken it for simple fact, the way one mistakes the ground beneath one's feet for something that could never, under any circumstance, be otherwise. But the ground was never as fixed as it appeared to you. There exists a hidden law, older than any single teacher who ever spoke of it aloud, quietly known to a rare few in every age, and just as quietly hidden from the many who never thought to look for it, the law that reality, far from being solid and unyielding, bends continually according to the state carried within the one who meets it. What appears immovable in your outer life, your circumstances, your relationships, the very shape of your days is, in truth, only the outward shadow of something inward, something you have always possessed the quiet power to shape, though no one ever thought to tell you so, and though you were never once shown how. This is not a teaching of force, and it will ask nothing of struggle from you. You will not be asked to wrestle the world into submission through sheer effort of will, nor to labor harder against circumstance than you already have. You are being asked, instead, to remember to recall a forgotten point of origin, the single quiet place from which every bend in reality first begins, and to recognize, at long last, that this place has never been outside you. It has always been within, waiting patiently for your attention to finally turn toward it. What follows in these pages is a rediscovery, not an invention of anything new. Step by careful step, across the parts that follow, you will be shown the quiet mechanics of this old and patient law, how a single thought becomes, in time, a circumstance, how feeling, deeply held, seals what thought alone can only begin, and how a life lived until now by accident may become, from this evening forward, a life lived by deliberate and gentle design. Set aside, if only for these hours, the long-held assumption that the world around you is fixed and unresponsive. Let that assumption fall away gently, the way an old and heavy coat is finally set down after a long journey, no longer needed, no longer carried. Enter what follows with an open mind and a receptive heart, for nothing in the teaching ahead will ask more of you than your simple willingness to see differently than you have ever allowed yourself to see before. The bending begins now, in this quiet hour, with you. Act 1, The World is Not What It Seems. Chapter 1, The Illusion of the Fixed World. Everett Callaway spent his days as a surveyor, walking the same quiet fields season after season with his chain and his brass instruments, measuring land he believed, without ever once questioning it, to be entirely fixed and unchangeable. A boundary, to Everett, was simply a boundary, a line drawn once and drawn forever, a fact of the earth no more open to argument than the rising of the sun each morning. It never occurred to him, in all his careful years of measurement, that anything about his own life, his modest income, his narrow prospects, the quiet disappointments that had gathered around him like fallen leaves, might work according to a gentler and more responsive law than the stone markers he set so carefully into the ground. What appears solid and unchangeable in daily life is, in truth, far more responsive to inner thought and feeling than most are ever taught to believe possible. The fixed world that governs so much of ordinary living, that shapes so many quiet resignations and so much patient suffering, is not an absolute truth handed down from the nature of things themselves. It is largely an inherited assumption, passed quietly from parent to child, from teacher to student, from one generation to the next, accepted without question, simply because it was never once questioned by those who taught it. Not far from where Everett walked his measured fields, a woman named Millicent Rowe lived out her days, accepting her circumstances as permanent fact, the way one accepts the changing of the seasons without complaint. Her modest means, her narrow opportunities, the quiet disappointments that had followed her through each passing year, all of it seemed to her simply the shape her life had been given. Fixed long before she was ever born, fixed by forces she could not name and would never think to question. She never once considered, not even in her most reflective moments, that her own inner state, her expectations, her private convictions about what life owed her and withheld from her, might be quietly shaping the very circumstances she had long since resigned herself to. Notice, gently and without judgment, where you too have accepted certain circumstances in your own life as simply fixed a financial ceiling you have never questioned, a relationship pattern you have assumed unchangeable, a limitation of talent or opportunity you inherited long ago and never once examined. Consider that what you have called fixed may in truth be only familiar, and familiarity, however comfortable, is not the same thing as truth. Practice. Tonight, sit quietly and identify one area of your life you have long assumed to be fixed and beyond your influence. Do not rush to solve it or to imagine its opposite just yet. Simply hold the assumption gently before you, as one might hold an old stone found along a path, and ask, for the very first time, whether it might in truth be otherwise than you have always believed. Chapter 2. The Architect Behind Your Eyes. A young draftsman named Lucius Barnwell spent the greater part of his working hours bent low over long tables covered in careful drawings, marveling, as he worked, at how a great and towering building existed first only as thin lines upon paper, nothing more than ink and careful measurement long before a single stone of it ever rose from the earth to meet the sky. He took genuine pride in this quiet mystery of his craft, the way an entire structure could be willed into existence through nothing more than careful attention given to paper. And yet, for all his daily wonder at this process, he never once suspected that his own life followed this very same quiet order, that it too was being drawn, moment by moment and day by day, long before it ever took visible shape in the world around him. Every circumstance met in the outer world has first been quietly drawn, in thought and in feeling, by an inner architect the reader has not yet learned to recognize as their own truest self. This inner architect does not announce its labor with any fanfare. It does not pause to ask permission before it begins its work. It labors silently and continually, in the background of every waking hour and every idle moment, whether its drawings are made with careful and deliberate intention or with careless. Unattended neglect for it draws regardless, and it draws always, whether or not its work is ever noticed by the one whose life it shapes. A woman named Dorothea Pratt, an acquaintance of Lucius who lived some streets away, blamed her circumstances entirely on chance, on ill fortune, and on the failings of others who she believed had wronged her at every turn. She never once suspected, in all her years of quiet blame, that an architect had been at work within her own mind all along, sketching, in patient and persistent lines, the very outcomes she so often lamented as unfair and undeserved, never once tracing them back to their true and quiet origin. Consider your own life, in this moment, as a structure already being drawn, its foundations laid, its walls rising, its rooms taking shape according to plans set down long before you thought to examine them. And ask yourself honestly and without flinching, who has truly been holding the pen all this time? Practice. Tonight, identify one current circumstance in your life, large or small, and trace it gently backward, step by patient step, to the inner thought or feeling that may have quietly drawn it into being long before it ever appeared. Chapter 3. Why Most Never Learn This Law. Young Herbert Cain was taught from the very earliest years of his childhood that Life simply happens to people, that circumstance arrives as weather arrives, unbidden and ungovernable, and that one's only proper task is to endure it as bravely and as quietly as possible. No one in his household, not his father, nor his mother, nor any of the elders who shaped his understanding of the world, ever once suggested that another way of living might exist beside this one. And so Herbert grew, as most do, believing this teaching to be the whole and final truth of things, never once told that there was more to learn, never once shown a door that might lead elsewhere. Generations upon generations have been conditioned, quietly and thoroughly, patiently and without any deliberate cruelty, to accept the world exactly as it appears on its surface. And this long conditioning, passed down through countless households, much like Herbert's, repeated at countless dinner tables and whispered in countless moments of quiet resignation, has kept the deeper law of reality hidden from all but a rare few who were, by whatever chance or grace, willing to look beyond what they had been so carefully taught. A woman named Agnes Whitmore stumbled upon this hidden law almost entirely by accident late in her own life, after decades spent believing precisely what Herbert had been taught in his childhood. She felt, upon first discovering it, not only wonder, but a quiet and unexpected sorrow, not sorrow for herself alone, though there was some of that too, but a deeper sorrow for all the years that had passed before anyone had thought to show her sooner what she now understood so clearly. Consider gently what you too were taught to accept without question in your own early years, what quiet resignations were handed to you before you were old enough to question them. And recognize this very moment, this quiet hour of listening, as your own exception to that long and ordinary pattern. Practice. Tonight, write down one belief about how life works that you were taught early in your own life, and consider honestly, without any obligation to change it just yet, whether it still serves the life you now wish to build for yourself. Chapter 4. The Mirror Principle. Beatrice Hollingsworth noticed something curious over the course of many months about her daily encounters with the world, that wherever she went, whomever she met, people seemed to treat her almost exactly as she quietly expected to be treated, though she had never once spoken this expectation aloud to a single living soul. She had not requested this treatment. She had not earned it through any particular effort. It simply arrived again and again, matching some private conviction she carried without ever examining it closely. The outer world acts as a faithful mirror, reflecting back with uncanny and often unsettling accuracy the state of mind carried quietly within the one who meets it. And because this is so, because the mirror can only ever show what stands before it, lasting change must always begin with the reflection's true source, the inner state itself, rather than with the image reflected outward, which can never be altered directly, no matter how hard or how long one tries to rearrange it from the outside. Reginald Ashby tried, again and again, across many frustrated years, to change his outer circumstances through sheer effort and strategy, while his inner state of frustration and quiet resentment remained entirely untouched beneath all his striving. And he found, to his growing bewilderment, the very same frustrations mirrored back to him in ever new forms dressed in different faces, arriving through different situations, but unmistakably, beneath their new disguises, the very same frustration he had carried within him all along. Consider what your own current circumstances might be quietly mirroring back to you about the inner state you have been carrying, perhaps for years, without ever pausing to notice it clearly. Practice. Tonight, identify one recurring pattern in your outer life, a repeated disappointment, a familiar frustration, and consider gently what inner state it may have been faithfully and patiently mirroring back to you all along. Chapter 5. The Space Between Stimulus and Reality. Walter Grimsby, a young telegraph operator, learned by slow and deliberate practice to pause, however briefly, before reacting to troubling news that crossed his wire each day. It was a small discipline at first, barely noticeable even to himself, a single breath held before responding, a moment's hesitation before allowing worry to take hold. And yet he discovered, to his quiet surprise, that this small pause changed not only his own mood in the immediate moment, but the very outcomes that seemed, mysteriously, to follow afterward. Within the brief space between an event and one's inner response to it lies the true point at which reality is bent, for it is the response, not the event itself, that instructs the deeper mind on what to create next. The event merely arrives, indifferent and unshaped. The response, and the response alone, decides what becomes of it in the hours and days that follow. Priscilla Notting, who worked in the very same telegraph office as Walter, reacted instantly and without any pause whatsoever to every disturbance that crossed her path, every piece of troubling news, every small frustration met immediately and without reflection. And she found her days shaped entirely by whatever circumstance happened to strike her first each morning, with no space left in which she might have chosen a different and more deliberate course. Notice your own habitual reactions, the ones you have carried so long they now feel automatic, and consider what might change in your life if even a small space were allowed to open before each one. Practice. The next time you meet an unsettling event, however small, pause deliberately before reacting. Take one slow breath in that quiet space and choose your response with intention, rather than allowing the event itself to choose it for you. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Power of Imagination. Solomon Peabody, a young inventor of modest means, was mocked openly by his neighbors for spending long hours each day imagining machines that did not yet exist anywhere in the world, contraptions his neighbors considered nothing more than idle fancy, the harmless daydreams of a man who ought to have been tending more practical matters. And yet, one by one, across many long and patient years, his imaginings began to take physical form in the world, until the very neighbors who had once mocked him stood in quiet astonishment before what he had built with his own hands, from nothing more than careful and sustained imagination. Imagination is not idle fancy, however lightly and however often it is dismissed by the practical-minded. It is the very tool by which the unseen is drawn steadily into the seen, and what is vividly imagined with genuine feeling is already, in a very real sense, taking its first and truest form long before any outward evidence appears to confirm what has quietly begun. Harriet Coswell, an acquaintance of Solomon's from the same small town, dismissed her own imaginings as mere daydreaming, idle wandering with no true bearing on her actual circumstances or her practical life. She never once suspected, in all her years of quiet dismissal, that her imaginings held any real power at all to shape the life unfolding steadily around her. Reconsider gently your own relationship to imagination, not as an escape from reality as you may have been taught to see it, but as its quiet and faithful forerunner, arriving always before the visible proof it eventually produces. Practice. Tonight, spend a few unhurried minutes vividly imagining one desired outcome in your own life, filling it with as much sensory detail as you can summon the sights, the sounds, the felt textures of the scene as though it were already unfolding gently before you. Chapter 7. Assumption, the root of all manifestation. Frederick Lowry, a modest clerk of unremarkable standing in his small office, began quietly assuming, without any outward evidence whatsoever to support the assumption, that he was a capable and deeply respected man. He did not announce this assumption to his colleagues. He did not seek their approval to hold it. He simply carried it quietly within himself, day after day, until slowly, without any single dramatic turn of events, he found others beginning to treat him exactly so, as though his own quiet inner assumption had somehow, invisibly, rearranged the way the world around him chose to respond. What a person assumes to be true about themselves and about their life, held persistently enough and without wavering, becomes, by a hidden and patient law, the very thing that eventually comes to pass. Assumption precedes and produces circumstance. It does not merely respond to circumstance after the fact, as most are taught to believe. Clarissa Dunmore, by contrast, assumed herself perpetually overlooked and unlucky in every venture she attempted, and found this quiet assumption confirmed again and again in ways that seemed to her, each and every time, like nothing more than simple and unrelated misfortune, never once tracing the pattern back to the assumption she herself had planted. Examine your own quiet assumptions about yourself, the ones so old and so familiar you no longer notice you are making them, and consider how faithfully those assumptions have already been reflected in the life you have built for yourself thus far. Practice. Tonight, identify one unhelpful assumption you have long held about yourself, and consciously choose a new one to hold gently in its place, repeating it softly to yourself as though it were already quietly true. Chapter 8. The Trap of Believing Your Eyes. Nathaniel Sparrow, a young farmer working land he had inherited from his father, refused to plant his fields each spring until he could already see rain clouds gathering above the horizon, and so he missed season after barren season, waiting patiently for proof that never quite arrived in time to satisfy his careful and anxious caution. Trusting only what the eyes currently show keeps a person bound tightly to a reality already fixed in the past, for the eyes can only ever report what already is, never what might yet quietly become. True change requires holding to an inner conviction the eyes have not yet confirmed, and may not confirm for some considerable time to come. Isadora Fenn, a neighboring farmer working land just across the valley from Nathaniel's, planted her hopes regardless of outward appearance, trusting an inner conviction long before any outward sign arrived to justify her faith, and reaped, in due season, a harvest that others throughout her valley considered entirely impossible under the circumstances. Consider where you, too, have been waiting patiently for the eyes to be convinced before allowing yourself the freedom to believe. Practice. Tonight, choose one area of your life where you will practice holding an inner conviction ahead of any outward evidence, however small and however uncertain this beginning may feel to you. Chapter 9. The Feeling That Seals the Law. Josephine Atwater repeated hopeful words to herself each day, faithfully and without fail, rising each morning to speak them aloud before her mirror, and yet she wondered, with growing and quiet frustration, why her circumstances remained so stubbornly unchanged, despite all her careful and diligent repetition. It is not thought alone, however carefully and however often repeated, but feeling deeply and genuinely held, that truly seals an intention into the fabric of what eventually becomes real. The deeper mind responds to genuine emotion far more readily and far more completely than it ever responds to words spoken without true feeling behind them, however sincere those words may sound to the one speaking them. Barnaby Holt discovered this quite by accident, in the very moment he first began to genuinely feel the relief and ease of his hoped-for outcome, rather than merely thinking of it in passing as he had done for so many months before. From that single moment forward, his circumstances began to shift with a speed that surprised even him, accustomed as he was to slow and gradual change. Examine whether your own hopeful thoughts have been accompanied by true and genuine feeling, or only by a hollow repetition offered without any real warmth behind it. Practice. Tonight, generate a genuine feeling of relief or joy connected to one specific desired outcome in your life. Do not merely think it in passing. Feel it fully, however briefly, as though it were already quietly true. Chapter 10. The First Bend. Elias Thorne, a young blacksmith of considerable skill, had spent many years shaping only iron with careful and deliberate intention at his forge. One evening, quite unexpectedly even to himself, he turned that same careful and practiced attention inward for the very first time, and consciously shaped a single thought about his own life with the very same intention and care he had always given so naturally to his craft. The first deliberate act of shaping one's inner world, however small and however modest it may seem in the moment, marks the true beginning of a life no longer lived by accident. This first bend, however slight, sets in motion a current that continues long afterward, quietly gathering force in ways the one who began it may not notice for some time. Cyrus Bramwell, a neighbor who watched Elias's quiet transformation unfold across many months, remained skeptical throughout the entire process, unwilling to attempt even this same small inner shift within his own life, and so remained, season after season, exactly where he had always been. Recognize that you too stand at this very same threshold now, in this quiet hour, and that even a single deliberate inner shift is enough, truly enough, to begin the bending. Practice. To close this first part of your journey, consciously and deliberately shape one single thought about your own life tonight, marking, quietly and without any need for fanfare, your own first bend. Act 2. The Sacred Practices of Bending Reality, Chapter 11. Living in the End. Marguerite Colt, a seamstress with a small shop on a quiet side street, began each day already feeling the quiet satisfaction of a full order book, though her ledger, if anyone had thought to examine it, currently showed otherwise. She did not wait for the orders to arrive before allowing herself this feeling of fullness and ease. She carried it with her each morning, from the moment she opened her eyes, as though it were already settled fact rather than distant hope, humming softly as she opened her shop, greeting each customer with the quiet confidence of one whose days were already, in some deeper sense, accounted for. Approaching each day already inhabiting the feeling of the fulfilled desire, rather than the feeling of its absence, is the master key by which the outer world begins, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to rearrange itself to match what is already felt within. This is not pretending, and it is not denial of present fact. It is a deliberate dwelling in the end already achieved, long before the means of its achievement have revealed themselves to the waking eye. Oswald Pratt, a tailor working not far from Marguerite's own small shop, began each day quite differently, dwelling each morning on what he lacked, the customers who had not come, the debts still owing, the quiet worry that had followed him to bed the night before and greeted him again upon waking. And he found, month after month, that his days faithfully confirmed that very same lack again and again, as though the world itself were simply answering the question he had unknowingly asked of it each morning. Notice, without any harshness toward yourself, whether you typically begin your own day from the feeling of lack, rehearsing what is missing before your feet have even touched the floor, or from the feeling of fulfillment already achieved, however quietly you may hold it. Practice. Tomorrow morning, before rising fully from your bed, spend a few unhurried moments consciously stepping into the felt sense of one desire already fulfilled. Do not force the feeling, simply allow it to settle over you gently and carry it with you as you begin the rest of your day. Chapter 12. The Art of Revision. Cornelia Hastings, troubled one particular afternoon by a curt and dismissive exchange with a shopkeeper who had spoken to her more sharply than the moment warranted, found the sting of it lingering with her throughout the remainder of her day, coloring even small unrelated matters with its quiet unpleasantness. That evening, before sleep, she quietly replayed the scene in her mind, revising it gently as she wished it had gone, imagining the shopkeeper speaking kindly, imagining herself responding with ease rather than hurt, and she felt, to her genuine relief, the sting of the encounter dissolve almost entirely as she did so, as though it had never truly happened in the form that had wounded her. Rewriting a disappointing moment in the mind, exactly as it was wished to have happened rather than as it actually occurred, quietly corrects the impression that moment would otherwise leave upon the subconscious. This correction undoes, gently and without struggle, the moment's power to shape further unwanted circumstance in the days and weeks that follow circumstance that might otherwise have grown from the seed of that original disappointment, left unattended and unrevised. Percival Dane, an acquaintance of Cornelia's from the same small town, handled his own daily disappointments quite differently. replaying them over and over in his mind exactly as they had occurred, down to every unkind word and every wounded feeling, never once revising a single detail. And in doing so entirely without meaning to, he unknowingly reinforced the very pattern of disappointment he most wished to be free of, strengthening with each replaying what he most wanted to release from his life. Consider a recent disappointment of your own that you have been replaying unrevised in your mind, and consider gently what revising it now this very evening might offer you in its place. Practice. Tonight, before sleep, reimagine one recent disappointing moment exactly as you wished it had unfolded from the very beginning. Allow this corrected version to settle gently in your mind as your final and lasting impression of the day. Chapter 13. Speaking Reality into Being. Augustine Marrow caught himself one ordinary afternoon while complaining to a neighbor about some small misfortune, repeating the phrase, "I never have any luck," a phrase he realized upon reflection he had spoken so often over so many years that it had become something like a private motto, uttered almost without his own awareness each time some small disappointment arrived at his door. And once he noticed it, he began to notice something else as well, how faithfully his days seemed to prove him right again and again, as though the world itself were simply answering back the very words he had so carelessly and so repeatedly offered it. The words habitually spoken, especially about oneself, act as quiet instructions to the world, which continually answers back in kind, faithfully and without exception. Careless speech, repeated often enough across enough years, becomes careless creation shaping circumstance long before the speaker ever notices the shaping taking place beneath their own words. Henrietta Blythe, who lived in the same quiet town as Augustine, deliberately changed her own habitual phrases once she came to understand this law, turning her speech, day by day, from complaint toward quiet and deliberate expectation. She noticed in time, not immediately, but gradually, as one notices the slow turning of a season, a corresponding shift in the responses she began to receive from the world around her, as though the world itself had simply been waiting for new instructions to follow. Notice the phrases you repeat most often about yourself, the small habitual sentences you may not even register as you speak them, and consider what those phrases may be quietly instructing the world to return to you. Practice. Tonight, identify one habitual phrase of complaint you often repeat about yourself or your circumstances, and replace it with a single new phrase of quiet expectation, speaking it gently to yourself as though it were already beginning to take root. Chapter 14. The Discipline of Attention. Theodore Winslow, a young gardener tending the grounds of a modest estate, noticed one season, something he had never quite articulated to himself before, that whichever bed of flowers received his daily and devoted attention grew strong and full and vivid with color, while the neglected bed nearby withered steadily regardless of the very same soil, the very same sunlight, the very same rainfall that fell equally upon both. Wherever attention rests longest, there reality begins, faithfully and without exception, to gather and to grow. The discipline of attention becomes, in this light, as vital to the shaping of one's life as the discipline of thought itself, for attention is nothing more nor less than thought sustained, thought given room and time and daily return in which to do its quiet work. Genevieve Halloway, who lived not far from the estate where Theodore tended his gardens, allowed her own attention to drift constantly from one worry to the next, never settling long enough on any single matter to nourish it, whether for good or ill. And she found her own circumstances just as scattered and just as ungrounded as her restless and wandering focus had always been, as though her life itself had taken on the shape of her own unattended mind. Consider where your own attention has been resting most often throughout your ordinary days, on which worries, which hopes, which repeated thoughts, and consider what it may be quietly cultivating in the soil of your life, whether you have meant it to or not. Practice. For a few minutes each day, gently redirect your scattered attention toward a single chosen focus, one hope, one intention, and hold it there without strain, returning to it patiently each time your mind wanders elsewhere. Chapter 15. Becoming Before Having. Leopold Ashworth, a young apprentice in a respected workshop, began carrying himself with the quiet confidence and unhurried bearing of a master craftsman long before he was ever given the title or the recognition that would normally accompany it. He did not wait for mastery to be conferred upon him by others before assuming its manner. He simply began to walk, to speak, to hold his tools as a master already would, and found, in time, that mastery itself arrived to meet him as though it had been waiting patiently only for his own bearing to catch up with what he had already quietly become. Reality bends most readily not to those who chase after pursuing possession as though it were a thing to be hunted down and captured, but to those who first become, in identity and in bearing, what they wish eventually to receive. Becoming precedes having in this law, it does not follow after it. However much the ordinary world insists the reverse must be true, Wilhelmina Crane, an acquaintance of Leopold's working in a similar trade, waited instead to feel confident until success had already arrived to prove her worthy of it, and so she remained waiting indefinitely. Year after uncertain year, since success continues to elude one who has not yet assumed its bearing, however long and however patiently that one continues to wait for it, consider whether you too have been waiting to have before allowing yourself to become waiting for proof, for permission, for some outward sign rather than becoming first, as Leopold learned to do so naturally. Practice. Identify one quality of the person you wish to become: confidence, ease, quiet mastery, and quietly embody that quality for a single day, carrying yourself as though it were already simply yours. Chapter 16. The Company of Your Imagination. Rosalind Ferris noticed, over the course of several difficult months, that the imagined arguments she rehearsed so often in her mind with a particularly difficult relative seemed to sour her mood and color her entire day, long before any real conversation between them ever actually took place. She would find herself, while washing dishes or walking to market, silently constructing entire exchanges of accusation and defense, feeling the sting of insults never actually spoken, and carrying that manufactured sting with her for hours afterward as though it had been real. The people and conversations rehearsed silently within the mind color, far more than most realize or would readily admit, the reality that eventually meets one outwardly in the visible world. The company kept in imagination matters every bit as much as the company kept in ordinary waking life, for the subconscious mind does not always distinguish sharply between an exchange truly experienced and one only vividly and repeatedly imagined. Bertram Coyle, an acquaintance of Rosalind's in the same small circle, imagined instead warm and encouraging exchanges with those around him, picturing kind words, patient understanding, generous interpretation of others' actions, and found, gradually, and without any direct effort on his part, his real relationships softening to match the gentler company he had already been keeping within his own imagination. Notice what inner conversations you have been rehearsing most often, whether in idle moments or in moments of particular difficulty, and consider whether these rehearsed exchanges serve the reality you truly wish to build for yourself. Practice. Tonight imagine one warm, encouraging exchange with someone in your life, a colleague, a family member, even a stranger, holding the feeling of it gently in your mind as though it had genuinely occurred. Chapter 17. Detachment. Releasing the grip. Cassius Wren gripped so tightly to the uncertain outcome of a business venture he had staked much upon that his anxious watching over its progress seemed, curiously, to delay its success at every turn, as though his very vigilance were somehow standing in the way of the ease he most wanted to arrive. Each evening he would review every small detail, every possible outcome, holding the matter so tightly in his mind that sleep itself became difficult, until at last, Exhausted beyond his own capacity for further worry, he simply let his hold soften. Holding a desire firmly yet loosely with clear intention but without desperate grasping allows that desire to arrive by its own natural and unhurried course. Anxious, grasping signals to the deeper mind a conviction of lack, while calm and settled holding signals the quiet assurance of one who already, in some essential sense, possesses what they seek. Ophelia Thistlewood, who had struggled for years toward a similar goal of her own, released her grip entirely one autumn, having grown weary of her own relentless striving, and found, to her quiet and genuine surprise, that what she had struggled so long and so anxiously to achieve now arrived with an ease she had never once thought possible during all her years of grasping. Consider where in your own life you have been gripping too tightly to some hoped-for outcome, and consider what might shift, gently, if you allowed yourself to loosen that grip, even slightly, even for a single evening. Practice. Tonight, choose one desire you have been holding with anxious tightness, and practice releasing it gently, offering it, as it were, to the natural and unhurried course of things, without demanding its immediate arrival. Chapter 18. Reading the Signs Reality Sends Back. Matthias Overby began to notice, in the weeks following his first tentative attempts at this new practice, small and unlikely coincidences appearing in his ordinary days, a chance meeting that led somewhere useful, a small and unexpected kindness from a stranger, a piece of information that arrived precisely when he needed it most. He very nearly overlooked each one as unremarkable chance, the ordinary shuffling of an indifferent world, until he began to notice how frequently, and how conveniently, such small coincidences seemed to be arriving since he had begun his quiet inner work. Such small coincidences and unexpected occurrences are reality's own quiet acknowledgement that inner work has genuinely begun to take hold, however modest that work may still be. Learning to notice these small signs, rather than dismissing them, strengthens the very faith that draws forth still more of the same in the days and weeks that follow. Eugenia Fairbanks, who had begun a similar practice around the same time as Matthias, dismissed every such sign that arose in her own life as mere accident, unworthy of any particular notice or gratitude, and so failed to nourish the very confidence that would have carried her further along the same encouraging path. Consider what small signs may already be appearing in your own life since you began this quiet work, signs you may have been too quick to dismiss as simple coincidence. Practice. Keep a brief daily note of one small, unlikely occurrence that may be a sign of reality responding to your inner practice, however minor or ordinary it may at first appear to you. Chapter 19. The Ritual of the Reality Bender. Alistair Crombie, a quiet clockmaker known throughout his town for his careful and patient craftsmanship, took up a brief daily practice of assumption, and feeling nothing elaborate, only a few familiar minutes repeated each morning and each evening, and over the course of many months, watched his circumstances shift so gradually, so quietly, that he barely noticed the change at all until, one ordinary day, it had become entirely undeniable to anyone who knew him well. It is not any single powerful thought, however sincerely felt in a solitary moment, but the devoted repetition of a simple daily ritual that ultimately transforms an idea into lived and lasting reality. Consistency, far more than intensity, is the true and quiet engine of this ancient law. Ida Marchbanks, an acquaintance of Alistair's in the same small town, tried the very same practices only sporadically, taking them up with enthusiasm for a few days before abandoning them whenever results seemed slow to arrive, and wondered, with growing frustration, why so little in her own life ever seemed to change despite her occasional efforts. Consider your own consistency in whatever practice you have begun, and recognize that a single day's effort, however sincere, is only the very beginning of a much longer and more patient unfolding. Practice. Assemble your own brief personal ritual from the practices you have already learned in this book, and resolved to repeat it faithfully each day going forward, regardless of how slowly results may seem to arrive. Chapter 20. Guarding Your Inner World. Roland Hargreave fell, almost without noticing, into the daily habit of dwelling on troubling news and idle complaint throughout his ordinary hours, a habit of mind that seemed harmless enough in any single moment, but which, gathered across an entire day, left him wondering why his more deliberate efforts at change seemed constantly and mysteriously undone by forces he could never quite identify or name. Whatever is allowed to occupy the mind in its unguarded moments, the idle minutes between tasks, the drifting thoughts before sleep, the casual complaints offered without a second thought, quietly shapes the reality being built, whether or not one ever intends it to. These unguarded moments must be tended with the very same care given to deliberate practice, for they are in truth far more numerous than the moments of deliberate practice ever are. Philippa Ainsworth, who lived not far from Roland, began gently guarding her own unguarded moments once she understood this law, filling them instead, whenever she noticed them arising, with calm and hopeful thought in place of idle complaint. And she found her overall progress accelerating considerably as a result, as though she had finally closed a door that had long been left carelessly open to whatever might wander through it. Consider what typically fills your own unguarded moments throughout an ordinary day, and whether what fills them truly serves the reality you wish, with such deliberate care, to build. Practice. To close this second part of your journey, notice one idle habit of thought that fills your own unguarded moments, and gently replace it with a calmer, more deliberate one, however small this small correction may seem. Act 3. Living as one who bends reality. Chapter 21. When Old Reality Resists. Gregory Ainswick, well along in his practice by this point, having watched his circumstances shift steadily and encouragingly for many months, was dismayed one particular week to find old and unwanted circumstances resurfacing just when he had believed them fully and finally behind him. An old financial worry he thought long resolved returned unexpectedly. A pattern of doubt he believed he had outgrown crept quietly back into his thoughts. He wondered with real discouragement whether all his careful and patient work had simply come undone in a single unfortunate week. The old familiar reality will often resist and reassert itself briefly, sometimes with surprising force, before yielding fully and finally to the new reality being shaped through patient inner work. This resistance is not failure, however much it may resemble failure in the discouraged moment of its arrival. It is a natural and passing stage that nearly every sincere practitioner meets somewhere along the longer path of transformation. Constance Aldridge, who had begun a similar practice around the same time as Gregory, mistook this very same resistance, when it arose in her own life, as certain proof that her efforts had failed entirely, and abandoned her practice altogether in genuine discouragement, precisely at the moment when steady and patient persistence would have carried her safely through to the other side of that same resistance. Recognize, should old and unwanted circumstances resurface in your own life after a period of encouraging progress, that this is not defeat, but simply the old order making its final and natural stand before giving way at last to what you have been so patiently building. Practice. When old circumstances resurface unexpectedly, pause and steady yourself before reacting with alarm. Return calmly and deliberately to your chosen assumption, exactly as you have practiced before, trusting that this resistance too shall pass in its own time. Chapter 22. The Law of Patience in an Impatient World. Old shipwright Barnabas Call, who had spent the whole of his working life building vessels along the same quiet harbor, understood something that no impatient merchant waiting anxiously for his ship could ever quite grasp, that no vessel, however urgently it may be needed, is ever built in a single hurried season. Each plank had its proper time to be laid. Each seam had its proper time to be sealed, and no amount of anxious pacing along the dock by an impatient buyer could hasten the wood's own need to settle and cure in its own unhurried time. Reality bends in this very same unhurried time, according to its own patient and ancient rhythm, and true mastery of this law requires trusting that timing fully rather than demanding immediate outward proof of progress at every turn. The demand for speed, however understandable, is itself a kind of resistance to the very law one hopes to make use of. Young Dorothea Linwood, eager and impatient as so many beginners are, abandoned her own new practice after only a handful of days, expecting an instant and dramatic transformation that never had time to properly arrive, and so uprooted the very seed she had only just planted, before it had been given any real chance to take hold in the soil of her life. Consider your own patience with this work, honestly and without self-judgment, and consider whether you have been expecting a harvest before its proper season has even had the chance to arrive. Practice. Tonight, offer yourself this quiet reminder before sleep, that your harvest ripens in its own unhurried season, and that patience, more than urgency, is the true companion of lasting change. Chapter 23. Doubt as the Great Unraveler. Frederick Aldous practiced his new assumptions faithfully each day, rarely missing a single morning or evening of his chosen ritual, and yet secretly, quietly, in a corner of his mind he rarely examined closely. He wondered whether any of it could truly work at all, whether the whole practice might simply be a comforting fiction he had chosen to believe. This quiet and largely unexamined doubt, left unaddressed for so many months, undid a considerable portion of the sincere effort he had otherwise so faithfully built. A single unexamined doubt, allowed to linger unaddressed within the mind, can quietly unravel a great deal of inner work already carefully done. Doubt of this kind must be met gently and released with patience, rather than fought outright or denied altogether, for struggle against doubt only strengthens its grip, the way struggling against a tightening knot only draws it tighter still. Sabina Winterbourne, who practiced a very similar ritual to Frederick's around the same season, met her own doubts quite differently whenever they arose within her. Rather than battling them or pretending they did not exist, she simply acknowledged each one calmly as it appeared. There is doubt again, visiting as it sometimes does, and returned her attention gently to her chosen feeling, finding, over the months that followed, that her doubt gradually lost its hold over her entirely. Notice your own doubts when they arise, not as enemies to be defeated through further struggle, but as passing visitors, present for a moment and then, with gentle attention, shown quietly to the door. Practice. When a doubtful thought arises before sleep or at any other quiet moment, simply notice it without alarm or struggle. Say quietly to yourself, "I see you, and I release you," and return gently to your chosen feeling of assurance. Chapter 24. Bending Reality in Relationships. Josephine Kettleworth, who had grown weary of years of quiet tension with her own sister, began one season to simply and privately assume that the strained relationship between them would improve, without ever raising the matter directly or attempting any deliberate confrontation to force a resolution, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, the tension between them gradually easing over the weeks and months that followed, softening in small and unremarkable ways she could never have engineered through direct effort alone. The same inner law that shapes outer circumstance also shapes, in subtler and less visible ways, how others respond to us in our closest relationships. A shift in one's own inner assumption about a relationship often precedes, quietly and invisibly, any outward and visible change in the other person's behavior, as though the assumption itself had gone ahead to prepare the way. Edmund Thackeray, by contrast, continued to assume the very worst of a difficult colleague he had long distrusted, expecting poor behavior at every turn, and found that colleague behaving, again and again, exactly as poorly as he had come to expect, as though his own quiet assumption had somehow invited the very conduct he most dreaded and most resented. Consider one relationship in your own life that troubles you, and consider how you might approach it differently by first, quietly and privately, changing your own inner assumption about the other person involved. Practice. Choose one relationship in your life and quietly assume a more favorable truth about the other person for a single day, holding this assumption gently without announcing it to anyone. Chapter 25. Bending Reality in Health and Vitality. Millicent Farrow began quietly assuming, each morning upon waking, a growing sense of ease and vitality within her own body, not denying whatever discomfort she genuinely felt, but gently choosing not to dwell upon it, and instead holding a quiet expectation of improving strength and ease. And she noticed, over the weeks that followed, a gentle and steady improvement in how she felt from one ordinary day to the next. The body, too, responds to the inner assumptions held about it, often more readily and more completely than is commonly believed by those trained to trust only what can be measured and observed. This teaching is offered here as a gentle complement to sensible and attentive care of the body, never as a replacement for it, for wisdom asks that both be honored together. Cornelius Vane, an acquaintance of Millicent's living in the same quiet town, dwelled constantly on his own ailments in thought and in conversation alike, describing his aches and discomforts to anyone who would listen, and found his condition lingering stubbornly long after it might otherwise have eased, as though his own persistent attention had become a kind of anchor holding the discomfort firmly in place. Consider the habitual thoughts you hold about your own body and your own vitality, and notice whether they tend, more often than not, toward complaint or toward quiet and gentle expectation of ease. Practice. Quietly assume a feeling of ease and vitality within your body for a few moments today, holding this feeling gently as your natural and settled state, without denying whatever discomfort may genuinely be present. Chapter 26. The Ripple Effect of a Changed Mind. Reginald Ashcombe noticed over a period of many months that as his own outlook grew steadily calmer and more assured through his continued practice, those closest to him, his wife, his children, even his more distant colleagues, seemed, without any explanation he could readily offer, to grow calmer as well in his presence, as though his own settled state were somehow being quietly absorbed by those nearest to him. As one's own inner reality shifts and settles, those within its reach, family, friends, colleagues, even strangers briefly encountered, often begin to shift as well, for the inner state radiates outward in ways far subtler than any word spoken or any action deliberately taken. Harriet Pemberton, by contrast, remained anxious and quietly discontented despite her sincere and genuine outward efforts to help and encourage those around her, and wondered with real puzzlement why her spoken encouragement never seemed to take root in the people she offered it to, however carefully she chose her words. Consider how your own inner state, whatever it may currently be, might already be rippling outward to those nearest you, whether or not you have paused to notice it. Practice. Before your next interaction with another person today, cultivate one calm and settled feeling within yourself, and carry that feeling with you deliberately into the exchange that follows. Chapter 27. Setbacks as Hidden Instruction. Aloysius Grant was deeply and genuinely discouraged when a venture he had long awaited and carefully prepared for collapsed entirely, seemingly without warning, leaving him for some weeks in real and understandable despair. Only many months later did he come to see, looking back with clearer eyes, that its collapse had quietly and precisely redirected him toward a far better path than the one he had originally set out upon and lost. What appears, in the discouraged moment of its arrival, to be nothing more than a setback often carries within it a quiet and patient correction, guiding the one who meets it toward truer alignment rather than signaling any failure of the law itself. The setback is not the law's mistake. It is often the law's own careful redirection. Beatrice Nolath, who met an early setback of her own around the same season as Aloysius, resisted and resented that setback so completely and for so long that she failed entirely to notice the quiet redirection it had been offering her all along. And so she remained for many discouraged months, exactly where the setback had first left her. Consider a past setback of your own, one that troubled you deeply at the time, and consider what hidden instruction or quiet redirection it may have carried within it, however difficult that setback felt in its original moment. Practice. Reflect gently this evening on one recent setback in your own life, and search patiently, without forcing an answer, for the redirection it may have quietly been offering you all along. Chapter 28. Those Who Bent Reality Before You. Old ship's captain Barnaby Ellison possessed an uncanny ability, well known throughout the harbor towns where he sailed, to navigate seemingly impossible circumstances with a calm and steady confidence his crew could never quite explain. They attributed it, among themselves, to some private and unspoken conviction he carried quietly within him, a conviction he never fully explained to anyone, not even to his closest and most trusted officers. Throughout the whole of recorded history, quiet and largely unremarked figures have shaped extraordinary outcomes by this same forgotten law, leaving behind only faint traces of their private practice in old letters and half-remembered family sayings, in journals rarely read by those who inherited them, traces waiting patiently for those willing to look closely enough to recognize them for what they truly are. A young descendant of the old captain, a woman named Sophronia Ellison, discovered her ancestor's private journal tucked away in a forgotten sea chest many years after his passing, and reading it by candlelight one quiet evening, she recognized, with genuine and quiet astonishment, the very practices she had only recently learned herself, recorded there in her ancestor's careful hand nearly a century before her own birth. Consider what quiet and unexplained successes may exist within your own family's history, or within your own community, successes that were perhaps never fully explained by those who achieved them. Practice. Reflect briefly this evening on one such story from your own life, family, or lineage, considering it now for the first time, in this new and quieter light. Chapter 29. Teaching Others to Bend Their Own Reality. Clementine Ashworth, having practiced this quiet law faithfully for some considerable time, and having watched her own circumstances shift steadily as a result, gently shared what she had learned one evening with a discouraged friend who had confided her own struggles and worries. Clementine offered the teaching freely, without insisting that her friend believe a single word of it, and found, in the very act of sharing, her own conviction and understanding deepening considerably, as though the teaching itself had rooted more firmly within her through the simple act of offering it to another. Sharing this quiet knowledge with others, freely and without any insistence upon their belief, deepens the giver's own mastery of the law considerably. What is taught with genuine sincerity becomes, through the teaching itself, more firmly rooted within the teacher than it ever was before the teaching began. Ambrose Colfax, who had learned this same law around the same season as Clementine, kept his newfound understanding entirely and jealously to himself, sharing it with no one, not even those closest to him, and found his own progress growing strangely stagnant as a result, as though the withholding itself had quietly closed some door that might otherwise have remained open. Consider whether there is someone in your own life, perhaps someone struggling as you once struggled, with whom you might quietly share this teaching in your own words and in your own time. Practice. Identify one person in your life with whom you might gently share a single teaching from this book, offered simply and in your own words without pressure or expectation. Chapter 30. The Reality That Needs No More Bending. Aged Cornelius Wren, having lived this quiet practice faithfully across the whole of a long life, found in his later years that the practice had become so natural to him, so woven into the very fabric of his ordinary days, that reality now seemed simply to arrange itself in his favor without any deliberate effort remaining on his part at all. He no longer rehearsed his assumptions each evening as he once had. They had become quite simply who he was. Once this law is truly learned and truly lived across enough patient years, it ceases altogether to be an effortful practice and becomes instead the natural and settled rhythm of an aligned mind, so that reality continues, of its own accord and without further striving, to bend gently and continually in one's favor. A young seeker named Wilhelmina Ashgrove, having heard of old Cornelius's quiet and uncanny ease, visited him one afternoon and asked him plainly the secret of his remarkable fortune. He considered her question for a long and thoughtful moment, and then answered simply that he no longer bent reality at all, for he and reality had long since ceased, in any meaningful sense, to be separate from one another. Imagine your own future self, years from this evening, for whom this practice requires no more conscious effort than the simple act of breathing. Practice. To close this third and final part of your journey, envision your own life, years from now, having lived this law so faithfully and for so long that reality simply meets you, gently and without resistance, exactly as you are. Epilogue. You now carry a quiet knowledge once held by only a rare few that reality was never truly fixed, only waiting patiently to be shaped by those who understood how to shape it. What once seemed to you an immovable and unyielding world has revealed itself, gradually and gently across these teachings, as something far more responsive than you were ever taught to believe possible. Consider for a moment the distance already traveled from that first quiet questioning of a world you had long assumed unchangeable, to this final and settled understanding you now hold within you. Your own inner work has already begun its quiet shaping of what is yet to come, whether or not outward proof has fully appeared before your eyes in this present moment. The world around you is no longer something to simply and passively endure. It is a doorway, and you now know quietly and surely how to walk through it, bending gently from this evening forward in your favor.